Welcome to the Soul Grit podcast. I'm Ann Taylor McNeese, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also love Jesus, and I'm passionate about all things gospel and therapy. I created Soul Grit to be at the intersection of mental health and Christian faith. Christ followers need a place to ask questions and get answers about mental health. Join me as we dive into real stories and real questions from people who want to honor God with their hearts, souls, and minds. Hello, welcome back to the Soul Grit podcast. This is Anne, and I'm here today with Brittany Tinsley. Hi, Brittany.
Hi.
Thanks for being here today. Now, Brittany is here. She is a writer, and she's also an advocate for people who have self-injury. And so today, if this is a little bit of a sensitive topic for you or somebody who might be riding along in the car with you, we just want to give you that little bit of a trigger warning that we are going to talk about self-injury, self-harm. And so listen to this when it's the appropriate time for you to listen to it. So Brittany, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank
I'm
you.
Brittany Tinsley. I'm a writer and self-injury support advocate. I'm also a mom of two girls. I live in the Dallas area and spend most of my time either homeschooling or shuttling my girls around or writing in this mental health and faith space. And so that's something I really love to do. And it's become the work that I do too, which is awesome.
Yeah, that's great. Anything that's like mental health and faith related, I'm looking for my people, and so you're
Yeah.
you're one of them. So, Brittany, why don't you go back a little bit into your history and tell us about how you even got on this journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I was 15, I cut myself for the first time. I grew up in a Christian home. I had always been a Christian. I mean, basically, as long as I can remember, I came to faith at a really young age. My family is also a military family, and so we moved around a lot. And every time my family moved, one of the first things we did was get plugged into a church.
Yeah.
So my family, right before my freshman year of high school, moved to San Diego, and I got plugged into a church there locally, got really involved in that community. And then that May of my freshman year of high school, one of my good friends killed himself. And when that happened, I decided it was my fault. I thought I should have noticed the signs. I thought I should have stopped it. I thought I was responsible in some way, but I didn't tell anybody that I was carrying that guilt. I just held on to it by myself. And over that summer, it just grew and grew and grew. And my life kind of became more and more unstable as I tried to manage that by myself. And that fall, I came home one night from school from a volleyball game and ended up hurting myself for the first time. And so I always tell people I kind of fell into it on accident. I didn't know that self-injury was a thing. I thought that I had created it or invented it. It wasn't something anybody was talking about. And so when I did it that first time and everything around me, all of this chaos and this really heightened emotion kind of stilled, I thought, I am a genius. I have figured out how to manage my life.
Mhm.
Maybe people are doing this. Maybe I'm just really smart and figured out the secret. I don't know, but this is what's going to work for me. And so I very quickly became really involved in this self-injury lifestyle of sorts. And I kept it really secret. Nobody expected that I was doing it. I didn't look like somebody who was struggling. I was a straight A honor student. I was, like I said, really involved at church. I was in all of these leadership positions. I was on my school's volleyball team. I had a boyfriend. I had a lot of friends. I didn't look like the person who you expect to be struggling. And so I liked that I could struggle in silence and kind of keep this hidden. It felt like this very secret way for me to manage what had become very out of control for me. And so for probably a period of 6 months or so, I kept it hidden. And then the self-injury that had been helping me control everything kind of spiraled out of control. It got to the point where I was scaring myself with it. It wasn't just something I was doing when I was really overwhelmed or upset. It was something that I was doing when I was too happy or too excited, or it just became my response to anything that felt like too much to deal with. And so I thought this maybe has become a little bit of a problem. This isn't exactly what I thought it was when I was getting into it. And so I did the thing I swore I would never do. And I told on myself. In the Christian community, we're really big on accountability. And so I thought, I just need some accountability. I thought, if I can just tell somebody that I'm struggling, they can help hold me accountable. And if I know somebody's going to ask me about this, then I'm not going to do it. And so I went to my youth group. There was a woman there who was in her early 20s at the time who volunteered with the youth group. And I thought, I'll tell her. She'll hold me accountable. We'll just get on top of this. It'll all be fine. And so I told her, and to her credit, she reacted incredibly well. Um, she was compassionate and kind and understanding and didn't shame me or make me feel bad about the self-injury. But she did tell me, like, if you can't get on top of this, then we're going to have to tell somebody else. We're going to have to tell, quote unquote, a real adult. And together we agreed that maybe that would be my youth pastor if it got to that point. But I was like, we're really not going to get there. I'm really going to be able to get on top of this. Accountability is going to fix this. It's all fine. It wasn't, and that didn't end up working. And so a couple weeks went by. Every week at church, she'd ask me if I had self-injured the week before. The answer was always yes. And so we decided that at that point it was time to tell my youth pastor. And so um, we went and met with him. And in the moment, he also reacted really well. He had a lot of questions. I don't think he fully understood exactly what self-injury was or what it was doing for me or why I couldn't stop doing it. Um, but he seemed relatively understanding. And I left that meeting and thought, okay, in a week or so, he's going to give me a list of resources and he's going to have the answer and we're going to figure this out. Kind of the same thing that I thought the whole time. Like, now that somebody else knows about this, surely it will be more manageable. And instead, he called me back the next week, and he told me that effective immediately, I wasn't going to be in any of the leadership positions I'd been in. Effective immediately, I wasn't welcome anytime that wasn't a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night. So none of our youth group events, none of the camps, nothing that was sort of extra. Um, and and part of me understood the fact that I had become a liability in his eyes, but
Mm,
the other part of me was like, I've been in these positions for the last 6 months, the entire time I've been doing this. The only thing that has changed is now you know about it. And
mhm,
instead of being met at this time in my life when I probably needed more support and community than at any other point, instead of being met with that, I was instead basically told you're no longer welcome here. Um, and that was something I hadn't really ever dealt with before in a faith space. That was really difficult. And so I sort of had this, I don't know, wrestling that I did with whether or not that was a response that God would have, whether that was just a human response. What did that mean for me as a person of faith? What did that mean for me as a Christian? Um, and I thought, I just have to figure this out on my own because these people who are supposed to be the church, who are supposed to be representative of God, aren't aren't loving me in a way that I feel like is Christ-like in the way that they should be. Like I said, my family's military, and so kind of about the same time that all of that unfolded, my family was gearing up for another move. And so we left San Diego, we moved to Texas, and and I thought I just need to get better at hiding this. I need to either stop or get better at hiding it because if I tell people my world's going to fall apart because that is what had happened in the weeks leading up to this move. And so there was a period of time there where I kind of got on top of the self-injury a little bit, where I slowed down. It wasn't as frequent, it wasn't as severe, but because I hadn't really dealt with any of it, I went right back to it. And I did learn how to hide it a little bit better. And again, it got to the point where it started becoming too much, where it started scaring me again. And so again, I thought, I don't know who to tell about this except for another youth pastor. We had ended up back at another church. I'd gotten involved again. And so again, I went and told my youth pastor at this new church what was going on. And unlike the first time, this youth pastor met me with such compassion, such understanding, so much grace, told me that that not only was I welcome, that he hoped I would continue to come anytime that the doors were open, that he wanted me to be there, that I was important to them, that I mattered to them. I think everything that really any of us wants to hear from a pastor at any point, that you're welcome, that you're understood, that you're seen, that you aren't too much. And so that was just such an opposite experience from the first one that I'd had with this first youth pastor that I thought, okay, like maybe this is going to be okay. And, I think for the first time at that point, I made a little bit of progress in terms of recovery. I graduated high school, I went to college, I kind of struggled on and off with self-injury through college and through early adulthood. And it really hasn't been until the last couple of years when I finally sat down and was like, maybe I really need to figure out what this is and what this is doing for me. When I started doing some intensive therapy and things like that, that it shifted from being this problem that I was just trying to manage or that I was just trying to constantly, like a beach ball, hold under the water and it was
Mhm.
flying up somewhere else. Um, that it finally shifted to be something that I actually sort of understood and understood why I was doing it and why I was making that choice. And once I understood that, then I was able to shift more into recovery. And so, really, the last couple of years, as I've been writing about this, I I write from what I call the messy middle of recovery. Like I don't have it figured out completely. It's something that I think will always be a work in progress for me. But I'm at a point now where I get to have the conversation and share about some of this because it's something that even though we talk about mental health a lot more now than we did maybe when I was 15 and started kind of this journey, self-injury specifically is something that is still so rarely talked about. And so I think that I'm in sort of a unique position to have so much lived experience in this area to also be able to speak into and hopefully offer some hope for people who are struggling right now or for people who have family members or friends who are struggling, to hopefully share some insight into how they can best support the people who they love.
Yeah. So as you're talking, I'm just wondering, like, how did your parents find out and how did they respond?
Yeah, my parents found out around the time that I told my youth pastor. My parents also found out. They intercepted an email that I had sent a friend and actually ended up going to my sister instead. And my sister gave them this email, and there was this very clear black and white admission of what had been going on in this email. They had suspected a little bit that maybe I had been self-injuring for a couple of months prior to that, but they didn't have any hard evidence. And I always had a story, um, and I think they just didn't really know what they were looking for too. And so they ended up finding out when I sent this email that they ended up reading, and they were scared. They were terrified of what it was and what maybe it would mean for me. And they drugged me to therapy, which I did not have any interest in participating in. And so I went into that therapist's office and I said, I know that you can't tell my parents exactly what I say, so I'm just not going to say anything. I just have to be in this room for an hour for a
Mm.
couple of weeks right before my family moved. And I thought if I can just make it to this move, everything's going to be swept under the rug and be forgotten. And that's kind of what happened. I went to therapy for probably 6 weeks or so. My
Mm.
family moved. I got better at hiding it. I think my parents believed that it was over. And it was for a brief window of time, but then I don't think that it ever really occurred to them that I would maybe pick it back up after that. And so it's not something that after that point they were really ever very aware of.
Wow. So they didn't make you start going to therapy when you moved to Texas?
No, no, they did not. Yeah, I think that I had just so convinced them that it was like this one-time thing that, and they wanted to believe that it was a one-time thing. I mean, I don't think any parent wants to think that their kid is hurting themselves. And so I think that the combination of the two and just the chaos of a move and everything made it really easy to say, well, this is probably taken care of. We've done our due diligence. We did the therapy thing for a few weeks. We moved, everything seems better, so it probably is.
Hmm. Yeah. As you have worked more into this, like becoming an advocate for support for
Yeah.
people who are going through this, I'm sure you've heard dozens of stories of
Mhm.
people who have various self-harm behaviors. So, well, first, I want to ask you, some people use the term self-injury and some people use the term self-harm. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about why you might choose one over the other or prefer one or over the other?
For me, they're pretty synonymous, honestly. I think the one that sometimes people use that gets a lot of pushback is self-mutilation. I think that
Mm.
feels a little bit more, I
It's
don't
pretty
know if I
brutal.
really mean derogatory exactly, but it comes, I think when other people say it, it kind of comes off that way. And so I think that's the one that most people that I know anyway like to avoid. But self-injury and self-harm, I think, are pretty synonymous.
Mhm. All right. And I also want to point out, just because I'm here to give the clinical
Yeah.
perspective too, that there's this whole category of behaviors that we call non-suicidal,
Hmm.
self-injurious behaviors. And so this is kind of a little acronym we have there. But um, the point being that the person that's doing this doesn't want to die necessarily.
Right.
They're not trying to do an injury or a harm to their body that's going to end their life, but they're
Hmm.
doing something like you described, that this is a way that I start to feel control over my situation, or I feel a break from everything that's going on, or this gives me that
Hmm.
moment of relief because, like, all of my senses are now tuned into that physical pain in my body instead of all the swirly emotions and thoughts that are going on in my head, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so as you've talked to other people who have these behaviors, um, I just would like you to help us understand, like, what could somebody be hiding and what should we look out for?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that immediately comes to mind is if you're seeing injuries on people that are in some sort of pattern, then that's probably related to self-injury. If you're seeing people wearing clothing in weather that doesn't necessarily make sense, long sleeves and long pants in really hot weather, that sort of thing, not wanting to put on a swimsuit. Obviously, there are other things that those signs can mean too, but I think in my world, in the world that I live in, and where I hear a lot from people who engage in self-injury, those are some things that are maybe a sign that there's something else going on. Um, I think that people want to think that people who are engaging in self-injury are really withdrawn and don't have a lot of friends and I don't know, spend all their time in a dark room or something. And maybe in some cases that's true. Obviously, I can't speak for everybody, but I think that most of the time the people who engage in self-injury that I've spoken with and um, that a lot of studies show is that people who engage in self-injury are really often high achieving perfectionistic type people. And so you're not necessarily looking for the like quote unquote stereotypical goth, emo, super depressed seeming kind
Yeah.
of person. Those people, while they could be engaging in self-injury, that's not necessarily the only sign that somebody is, or even a hint that somebody is. A lot of times they look like somebody who sort of has everything together on the outside, which I think is why it's so hard to identify when somebody might be struggling with this unless they just come out and tell you point blank.
Right. Now, you shared that when you were 15, you began to cut yourself.
Yeah.
And so cutting is, I don't know, it's pretty familiar in our culture right now. I mean,
Yeah.
I used to work at a school and we had girls who were as young as 10 or 11 that were starting
Mhm.
to get into this behavior. But cutting is not the only self-injurious behavior. So, do you mind just like helping us understand what are some other ones that people might get
Yeah.
in?
Yeah. So I can read the definition if you don't mind. So
Yeah.
the International Society for the Study of Self-Injury defines non-suicidal self-injury, which is what you were talking about before, NSSI, as the deliberate self-inflicted damage of body tissue without suicidal intent and for purposes not socially or culturally sanctioned. So we're not talking about piercings or tattoos or things like that. We're talking about cutting, we're talking about burning, we're talking about skin picking in some instances, hitting yourself, hitting other objects, any sort of thing that is harmful to your body that isn't rooted in something else, essentially, can fall under the self-injury label. But I would say probably cutting, burning, hitting, those are the most common that I have heard of. And obviously I've done some of those. So that's where my experience lies. But
Yeah. And then I know that a lot of girls in particular will maybe cut like on their upper legs or torso
mhm,
so that it's really easily hidden by
yeah,
clothing.
right.
And then sometimes like on the wrist area because you can cover it up with a sleeve or a bracelet.
Hmm.
Is there any other area that might be a concern?
Yeah, I think that probably the most common are the non-dominant arm, because obviously it's easier to hurt yourself with your dominant hand than it is your
Mhm.
non-dominant hand. So your non-dominant arm, like you said, your upper thighs, some people self-harm on their stomachs because again, it's something that's really easily hidden, or upper arms. Like if you picture somebody wearing like short sleeves and shorts, any part of your body that would be covered by that
Mhm.
is probably an area where somebody is inclined to self-harm because it's like you said, really easily hidden, even if it's a summer month and it's hotter weather and
Right.
whatever.
Yeah. If you've listened to the Soul Grit podcast for even one episode, you know my guests and I believe that when we integrate the power of God with the wisdom of modern psychology, we get supercharged healing, change, and growth in counseling. As a Christian therapist, however, I realize that there are many practitioners out there who are personally Christians but don't know how to integrate their faith into their counseling practices. That's why I created the e-course, Faith Integration for Therapists. In this premium 5-module course, therapists who love Jesus will learn everything from understanding their calling, to marketing their practices to Christians, to adapting evidence-based interventions to honor our faith. You can learn more about the online course at www.soulgritresources.com/courses and send an email to info@soulgritresources.com to receive a discount code. Do you have any statistics? And if you don't, it's okay. We can put that in later, but about how much of our population is doing this? What are the ages that it's most likely to occur?
Yeah, so 17% of adolescents have self-harmed. I think that the statistic is about 13% of young adults, which I think based on this one study was, I want to say 18 to 22-ish, sort of college age. And then 5% of adults report a lifetime history of self-injury. So it's not an insignificant number of people. I mean, if you think about 17% of adolescents, that's almost 1 in 4. And those numbers are likely on the low end because this is something people keep hidden. It's not something people are typically volunteering that they're doing. And so if you think that 17% is the number that has been reported, in reality, that number is likely
Wow.
higher. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And for your experience, like you mentioned, your first line of defense was, I'll tell my youth leader, I'll tell my youth pastor.
Hmm.
And we've talked about that previously on the podcast, how for a lot of Christians, that is your first line of defense. Like before you go to see a therapist or a
Hmm.
doctor, you want the spiritual support, the shepherding that happens from your faith leader.
Yeah.
And so we've also talked on the podcast that sometimes our pastors are not equipped to deal with some of these mental health issues that really
Hmm.
need more of a clinical approach. So, what would you say? What do youth leaders need to know, or what would you like them to be able to be more equipped in?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people are well intentioned. I think that there's a very small subset of pastors in general who are trying to cause harm. And so I think that specifically with self-injury as it relates to faith spaces, most people are just really ill-equipped because it's not something that they're prepared to deal with. And so I think that first of all, if youth pastors recognize you're working with a population where there is a high an incident rate of this happening, and that you actually do need to be prepared to handle this if somebody admits it to you, I think that that's a key first step because then you're not going to be caught off guard. And I think part of responding to this well, if you're in a position where you know you're likely to face it, is to not be caught off guard by it. And so I think if you can have a set of resources available, whether that's just counselors in your area who you can refer to, or information about online support groups that meet and that deal with this, anything like that would be helpful. As far as the actual like conversations and reactions go, though, I think that just leading with compassion is so helpful because when you're in that position where you're coming and you're about to make this huge admission, it's so scary. It's probably one of the scariest things that this person will have done in their life up to that point. To have somebody look at you with anything other than just complete compassion and grace is so hard and feels like a rejection. And when you're talking about somebody who has authority in a faith space that in some way is potentially representative of Christ, to feel like you're being rejected, even though it's only rejected by a human, it can feel like you are being rejected by God. And the fact that then will have this ripple effect potentially through the person's life, I think is something that you can't overlook. And so I think just remembering, no matter how scary or how overwhelming or I don't know, how ill prepared you feel, that if you can just in that moment be compassionate, and have this sort of gentle, grace-filled curiosity about what the person's saying, I think that just goes such a long way.
Mhm. It made me wonder, did you ever like understand the youth pastor in San Diego? Like, why did they remove you from all of those?
Yeah, I think that at the time it was really hard for me to understand. I mean, I was a 15-year-old
Mhm.
and who had just been essentially kicked out of the only community that she had. And so I think at the
Yeah.
time I was just really angry and defensive about it. Looking back now, I understand and can see that obviously if you have somebody who is involved in some sort of questionable behavior, that that's not necessarily a person you want in leadership positions. And so it's easier for me to make sense of that and to say, well, obviously I should have stepped down from those positions than it is for me to say I should have been kicked out of the community entirely.
Mhm.
Because, so many of us are struggling with so many different things. I wasn't the only kid in that youth group struggling.
Right.
I might have been the only one struggling with self-injury, but I certainly wasn't the only one struggling with anything. And to I think put self-injury specifically sort of on this pedestal of like, well, this is the worst of the worst, just is still to this day doesn't really make much sense to me. But again, I have to fall back on this idea that most people are well-intentioned and ill-informed. And I think that was most likely the case, is that he was trying to do the best he could for the youth group at large.
Mm.
And unfortunately for me, was ill-informed on what would actually be helpful and about what self-injury actually was, and didn't respond in a way that was very helpful for me personally.
Yeah. Yeah. That just breaks my heart that that happened to you. And even that, there may have been other people struggling that realize like, okay, we just don't want to talk about what we're struggling with because look what could
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're told as Christians, you're supposed to come with what you're struggling with to church.
Mhm.
You're supposed to bring that to church. This is a safe place. This is a safe place to be real, to share your struggle, your sin, your whatever it is that's going on in your life. And so I think that anytime somebody brings something real and then is essentially ostracized or cast out or excommunicated or whatever word you want to use, for sharing that's
Mhm.
obviously difficult for that person, but it also, I think, makes the other people who remain in that community more hesitant to come and show up in a real way, because if it happens to one person, it could happen to you too.
Mm. Do you think self-injury is a sin?
I was actually just having this conversation with somebody the other night, at a speaking event that I did, and I don't think it is. I think that we like to ascribe morality to struggle sometimes, and I don't think that it's helpful. Um, and this is obviously like such a nuanced topic that probably requires a lot more discussion than I can get into here. Um, but I think that if you look at the Bible, you've got people who struggle with all sorts of things. You got Paul, who had this thorn in the flesh that we're never really told what it is,
Right.
that wasn't, the fact that he struggled with that wasn't a sin. It was just part of who he was as a person. And so I don't think that just because we struggle, that a struggle necessarily falls under the category of a sinful behavior, especially when you're talking about something in the mental health space. We don't look at people who have cancer and say, well, you have cancer, you must be sinning. And so in the same way that we don't say that, I don't think you can look at somebody who struggles with something in the mental health space and say, well, you struggle with self-injury, you must be sinning because your brain is telling you that this is a good idea, or that this is going to make you feel better, or something like that. So I think it's a tricky topic for sure, but personally I don't think that it falls into the sin category. And I wouldn't have always given that answer. At one point I would have
Mm.
definitely told you I thought it was a sin, and that if I just prayed harder or was a better Christian or whatever, then it would get
Mhm.
better or be fixed. And I don't think that that's the case anymore. I think that I'm more comfortable in a faith and in my faith that lets me say that people struggle, and to struggle is not necessarily to sin.
Mhm. Yeah. And I know like from some of my own struggles, like you can do the behavior that's part of your struggle and it really not be sin and you're really
Hmm.
just like you said, you're just struggling and you need
Yep.
God's help.
Yep.
And then you can sometimes do the behavior where you actually do kind of have control over it and you're doing it
Right.
anyway.
Right.
You
Right.
know?
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it such a tricky conversation, because there is an element of choice to it. And you can't, self-injury is an active behavior. And so to some degree, there is that choice piece that you can't remove. But I think that it's a discussion about where's the line between what's choice and
Yeah.
what's not choice, what's just trying to survive.
Yeah.
And it's tricky. It's tricky to figure out for sure.
I think I would like the audience just to know that message though, that if you're struggling with this, or if you maybe have a child or a loved one that's struggling with this, that this doesn't mean that they don't have faith or that they're like morally questionable or any of those things, but it does definitely mean that they're struggling and that you
Yeah,
could come alongside them and help them struggle through this.
absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit too, because now you're a parent,
Yeah,
and I don't know if you fear for your kids the way I do for mine, that they're going to have the same kind of struggles that I've had, but
yeah.
what advice would you give to parents?
I think that it is something I've thought about. I have two girls and they're not at an age yet where that's something that they struggle with. And obviously I hope it's something they never struggle with. But I do think that just being having really open communication, if your kids are young enough that you can still establish open communication, I think that that is such a key because if you have created an environment where your child feels comfortable coming to you and telling you like, hey, I'm dealing with these things that are really overwhelming, then
Mhm.
potentially sort of circumvent the whole thing entirely because instead of them feeling like they have to figure things out on their own, they're in a situation where they feel like they have support and where they feel like there's this openness for them to admit that things are hard when they're hard. So I think that that's if you can get to that point before you deal with any of this, then that's just fabulous. I think if you're already in it and you've got a child who's struggling and maybe they're struggling with self-injury or you think they're going down that path, um, I think that recognizing you don't have to have the conversation all at once can be really helpful. I've talked to a lot of teenagers who struggle with self-injury, whose parents feel like or parents who have teenagers struggling with this, who feel like, well, I've made this discovery and I've got one shot at this conversation. And if I don't do it right,
Mm.
then this is all over and they're going to go kill themselves and it's going to be this horrific situation. And most of the time, that isn't true. Most of the time, you have time to have this conversation in a calm and rational manner. And so, if you suspect your child is self-injuring and you go to them and you ask them point blank and they freak out or they say yes and then it gets really emotional or they say yes and you get really emotional, it's okay to pause the conversation and say, this is really important and I'd like to have this conversation. Well, can we talk about this on this day or at this time or at a time when we both are a little bit calmer or whatever you feel like the situation requires. But I don't think you have to have the conversation all at once. And I also think that if your child is struggling with this, um, creating a space where they feel safe coming to you after you've made the discovery, where they feel safe coming and saying, hey, I've done this again, I've engaged in this behavior again, um, can be really powerful because so much of self-injury is based around secrecy and sort of the shame cycle that you get in. And so I think that anytime you can remove that to some degree, that's a win. Um, and on just a really practical level, like if your kid is engaging in self-injury, making sure they know how to take care of wounds. They're probably not going to stop cold turkey. This is probably going to be something that takes a little bit to figure out, even if they have all the support in the world. And so I think that just from a very practical standpoint, saying, do you know how to take care of these injuries? We don't want there to be further harm. Like, here's how you take care of yourself after you have done this behavior. And I think that a lot of parents hear that, a lot of people hear that, and they go, oh gosh, well, if I'm doing that, then I'm essentially like giving them permission to continue this behavior. Um, and and I see why people get there, why they make that leap. But I think that when somebody's self-injuring, they are just in so much pain that even just having somebody come alongside you and say, hey, I see that you're hurting and I want to help you take care of this hurt, this very real, very physical, actual hurt that you have, um, can be healing too. So
Yeah.
I don't think that there's a lot of wrong that you can do as a parent if you're trying to understand, if you're approaching your child with compassion, if you're willing to listen to answers, and being willing to let them figure it out, to not have an answer. I think that just the freedom and the space and the breathing room to sort of walk through what's probably going to be a long journey together is the best piece of advice I can offer rather than just immediately jumping into we have to solve this right now crisis mode,
Mm.
which I think is sort of the natural inclination. And as a parent, I totally understand that inclination, but I think so often that um, actually maybe ends up being a little bit more harmful than a slow and steady, like, let's figure this out together kind of approach.
Okay. Yeah, I can remember when I was working in schools, there were sometimes like a kid would tell another kid, and now
Yeah.
that other kid is kind of freaking out a little bit and
Hmm.
tells their parent, and then the parent calls the school and asks to talk to the mental health counselor, which was me.
Yeah.
So, and in that situation, it would be like, okay, so the kid has told another kid, but they haven't told their parents. And now I have
Hmm.
this information and I'm going to have to call in the parent to talk about
Yeah.
the behavior. And it can get really complicated.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you didn't really give therapy a shot until you were
Yeah.
an adult, right? You took yourself
Right.
to therapy,
Yeah.
right? Do you think that everybody who struggles with self-injury needs to go to therapy?
I think that everybody, whether or not they struggle with self-injury, can probably benefit from therapy. So I don't think that going to therapy is a bad thing ever. If I could go back and do it again, I would tell my 15-year-old self, like, you have been given a gift to be in this therapy office. Like, take advantage of it. Don't be such a dumb teenager. Like, just give in to the process. So I think that therapy can be really, really helpful for me as an adult. It has been really helpful. I also know that it can be really scary to go into a therapist office and tell them that you're self-injuring, because there's this fear that people are going to think it's a suicide attempt, and what that's going to mean and how the therapist is going to react and what sort of things are going to be set in motion if you make this admission to a therapist who maybe doesn't know exactly how to
Mhm.
deal with self-injury or what it is or what it really is. And so um, I just had this conversation the other day with somebody, but they said, well, how do I even tell my therapist? I go to therapy already. I already have a therapist, but I've never told them about my self-injury. How do I bring it up without them freaking out? And so the advice I always give, and maybe you can tell me whether this is a good piece of advice or not, but the piece of advice that I always give to people is you don't have to tell them you're struggling with it up front. You can ask a hypothetical question. If you had a client who was struggling with self-injury, how would you deal with it? And they're probably going to know where this is going, right? Like,
Yeah.
therapists aren't stupid. They're probably going to figure out what the conversation is, but it's a way to kind of test the waters that doesn't feel quite so direct, that maybe makes the subject a little bit more approachable, where you can sort of ease your way into it, because I think that therapists are therapists because they want to help people, and they're trained in how to help people. And so if you have a place where you can receive help, or if therapy is an option for you, then I think that it's really smart to engage in a way that you can, in the best way that you can, to receive the most help that you can. It's never bad to have more support.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. I would know. I would see through
Yeah.
that if somebody asked me that. But that's okay. Because as a therapist, I would just take that in and I would be like, I'm just wondering why that's something you wanted to ask
Yeah.
about today.
Yeah, I think it opens the conversation in a way that's less scary. It's really scary to come in and just point blank, in 5 minutes into a session, be like, "Hey, I'm self-injuring," because it just is so blunt, and maybe some people are comfortable with that and others aren't. But if you're not comfortable with that, then I think this, like, hypothetical, what would you do if, is a way to give them the information without really giving them the information until it feels a little bit more comfortable, or then gives the therapist the opportunity to ask the question back. And once they've asked the question back, then it feels maybe a little bit safer to actually divulge the real story.
Yeah. Well, I would say a lot of times as a therapist, people kind of assume that you're gonna like dole out advice or that you're
Hmm.
gonna, like you said, set something in motion. But I think that one of my primary roles as a therapist is just to ask questions,
Yeah.
like what's going on, that first that you're bringing this topic up or that you use this behavior, like what else is going on, like where do we need to build in some different coping skills or get
Hmm.
you some support, or so like my first
Yeah.
thing is like I have to ask questions first,
Right.
so it's not going to be like, oh no, I got to create a safety plan and call 911. It's not it's not like jumping right
Yeah.
to that, but I would want to do a proper assessment and make sure that you're safe. So if you
Yeah.
came in and like I've had clients that will show me their skin, and I've had other clients that have just, said, yes, this is something that happens,
Hmm.
and I don't need to see it. But um, the first thing I just want to do is to make sure you're safe, you
Yeah.
know? And is this a suicidal behavior or is this one of those non-suicidal
Hmm.
behaviors? Because if it's a suicidal behavior, then yes, we need to put something else in motion just to make sure
Right.
you're safe. I want you to keep living, even if you don't like it. I don't want you to keep
Yeah.
living. And if it is one of those, like what you're describing, where I don't want to die, I just want some relief. This is the
Yeah.
only thing that makes me feel in control. It's similar to like an eating disorder, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, then I want to say, okay, I get that. I get why you would want to do that thing. And also I want to help you develop some other resources so that that doesn't have to be the thing that you
Right.
do. We want to keep your body intact. So let's develop some coping skills. Let's strengthen your support network. Let's go through some other therapeutic modalities, maybe like change your thinking patterns. And then we would go through
Mhm.
all of that. It wouldn't be necessarily like check you into the hospital. You
Right.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's, so good for people to hear because I think that that was always my fear. And I think that that's a fear I hear all the time from people is
Yeah.
I'm just so scared if I say this, then I'm gonna get sent to the hospital and I don't want to be in the hospital. And while there's nothing wrong with being in the hospital, and sometimes that's what people need and what's best for them, so often self-injury isn't the thing that would make you be required to go to the hospital. And so I think that hearing a therapist say, if you admit this, I'm not sending you straight to the hospital is encouraging for people.
Yeah. And basically, yeah, we do have to take like suicidal ideation really seriously.
Yeah.
But I want to do everything in my power for you not to have to get on a 72-hour hold. Like
Yeah.
that's rarely good for people. So
Right.
I want to make sure that that's like a last resort for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sure along the way you learned some tips and tricks for if you get the urge to do the thing, like
Yeah.
what can you do instead? No.
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of suggestions that you can find online. I remember being 15 and just Googling all the time, like, how do I not cut myself? And going down these lists of things, journaling, reading, listening to music, going outside. And they're all the things that are really practical and doable that you hear when as alternate coping skills, whether it's for self-injury or for another behavior. Mindfulness, grounding, gratitude, sort of exercise, responsible exercise, that sort of thing. And I think that those can be really beneficial for people to try. I think the thing that for me was probably the most helpful was, um, and it's probably going to sound a little counterintuitive, but I would tell myself, you have to wait 1 minute. And if at the end of 1 minute, then you still want to hurt yourself, then you can do it because you've waited. But
Mhm.
if at the end of that 1 minute, I was like, I don't know. I don't know if I want to still, I'd make myself go another minute and so on and so on. And as I made it through that minute more and more times, I increased the amount of time that I had to wait. And so it got to the point where I'd wait 5 minutes and then 20 minutes. And then eventually I have to wait a whole day. And if tomorrow I still want to self-injure, then I can't. And so I think that for me, giving myself the permission to still do the behavior if whatever it was hadn't resolved, made me feel like I wasn't just having to cold turkey quit this
Yeah.
thing that was really helpful. And in that time, I was doing other things too. It wasn't like I was just sitting and staring at the clock for 24 hours straight. I'm living my life and doing other things. And so most of the time, by the time that 24 hours had passed, I didn't want to do it anymore and I didn't need to. And so then I didn't engage in that behavior. But, when I first started trying to quit, I think that just make it for 1 minute um, sort of marker was something that was more helpful for me than, well, I'm going to go distract myself for 5 minutes by journaling. And then the urge hadn't really gone away. And so then I'd want to do it anyway. And then I'd feel really shamed about the fact that I still wanted to do it after I'd tried this alternate coping mechanism. And so I think that was something that was helpful for me. Something my therapist actually just told me, I don't know, probably a year ago that sort of changed the way that I think about this too and coping mechanisms in general was she told me that you're not trying to go if wanting to self-injure is a 10, you're not trying to go from a 10 to a 0 with journaling. You're not trying to go from a 10 to a 0 with going for a walk or whatever your favorite coping mechanism is. You're not trying to go from a 10 to a 0. You're trying to go from a 10 to a 9 and then from a 9 to an 8 and then an 8 to a 7 and so on and so forth. And so for me, that was like I don't know why that had never occurred to me before, but that was like a mind-blowing shift for me that I wasn't just trying to go from I'm all the way up here to I have no desire to do this whatsoever, that it's very much this baby step down process. And so I think with that mindset in place, that it became much easier for me to say, well, maybe some of these other things that for a long time I thought didn't work for me at all, maybe they actually do work for me. They just don't work for me in the way that I expected them to work for me. Maybe journaling or coloring or playing my guitar or whatever really actually is helpful because it's taking me from a 10 to an 8, and an 8's more manageable than a 10 is. Or
Yeah.
and then when I get to that 8, then I can switch and do something else and go from an 8 to a 4, and a 4 is much more manageable than even an 8 is, or whatever the case may be. So I think that hearing somebody say that to me was a really big shift in just how I think about
Hmm.
withstanding those urges, even as an adult.
Yeah, that's really important. I was thinking like if the project is, building something in your house,
Yeah.
with an example, but you got to build something. You don't just like come in and be like, I got my hammer, and so I'm going to get this entire job done. You
Right.
know, you have to do some of the job is going to require a hammer, and then you're going to need to switch to a screwdriver, and you're going to need to switch
Mm-hmm.
to a saw, and you're going to need to use your tape measure. And you're not using all of those all at one moment. You're using them in succession to get the job done. And
Yeah.
so that's what I try to teach people about coping skills. Like I may give you like 15 different things, and any given day, 13 of them are you're going to look at them and you're going to think that's stupid. I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
And but if you can have one or two that you're willing to buy into, and then kind of switch off with them. And maybe when that brings it, like you said, from a 10 to an 8, okay, yeah, I'll do the coloring book or I'll do
Yeah.
that, whatever the thing is that is going to help you bring down that level of emotion that's causing you to do the thing that you don't want to do.
Yeah, I think that that building thing is a great example. I think that's awesome because that's exactly what it is. It's not, you're not gonna, one thing isn't necessarily going to be the thing that fixes it every time. And what worked for you one day might not work for you the next time. And those things work differently and in different ways and in different situations. And so having an arsenal of tools
Mhm.
um, is more helpful than just being limited by one or two
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. I also like to have people, especially when I'm doing CBT, I like them to understand like you're not going to get from these negative thoughts to these alternate, more positive possibilities
Mhm.
because you just don't believe it. And so
Yeah.
what I'm trying to do is create a 1% opening. But
Mhm.
instead of thinking about like opening your garage door 1 inch and now it's 1 inch all the way across the bottom, we're talking about creating a wedge. So it's a 1 degree,
Mhm.
but at the point where it starts, it's like so close to zero you can't even discern it. But as
Yeah.
it grows out, it's creating the wedge is getting bigger. And in that
Yeah.
space where the wedge has gotten bigger, that's where your growth is happening. You're
Mhm.
getting further and further away from that negative thought or the negative feeling.
Yeah, that's really good.
Thanks. Um, okay, so we've gone through some tips and some ideas for getting support, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about how people can get in touch with your writing and or any other projects you're working on.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. That's where I like to hang out the most in terms of social media. I'm Brittany Tinsley Writes, Writes there. And I also send out a weekly newsletter through Substack. You can find that either at the link in my Instagram bio or at brittanytinsley.substack.com. Those are the two places where I write the most. But I'm working on a book project and we'll hopefully have more news to share about that soon.
Okay, when your book is ready, we'll have you back on and you can talk
Awesome.
about it. And in the meantime, I'll make sure people have those links in the show notes so that they can find you and just see what else you're up to. Now, I want to wrap up our interview by asking you, what are you doing for soul care?
Yeah, I love this question so much. The first thing that comes to mind, and I think this is kind of silly, which is part of why I love it, is I am not very good at playing. And I have been for the last couple of months figuring out what play and fun look like for me. And we got my girls a trampoline for Christmas. And I have been out on our trampoline just by myself without my kids, jumping on the trampoline by myself. Um, for I don't know, the last couple of weeks as it's gotten warmer here in Texas, but that has been something that I think has just been so good for my soul to sort of tap back into this element of play and fun and I don't know, some degree of innocence that I gave up a really, really long time ago. And so, as silly as it is, I think that that has been something that has been really good for my soul care in the last couple
Yeah,
of months.
I love that. And you're getting exercise too.
Yeah, that's never a bad thing. That's never a bad thing.
Okay, so now that you've been practicing your trampolining by yourself,
Yeah.
are you out there with your girls too?
I am. We actually just were out there yesterday. It's been like 80, 90 degrees in Texas here already, even though it's, February.
Mhm.
And so yesterday, I'm sure if there are doctors or nurses listening to this, they're going to cringe, but we had our sprinkler out under the trampoline and, we're jumping with the water on the trampoline. And they
Yeah,
thought it was just the best
the
thing that we
best.
had ever done. And they were so excited that I was out there with them. And so, it's fun. They're at a fun age and it's fun to do fun things with them.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that's good for your soul, but it's
Yeah.
also good for theirs to
Yeah.
have a mom that plays with them.
Yeah.
So, good for you. Okay, well, Brittany, thank you so much again for sharing your personal story and all of the work that you've done as an advocate in this area to help us just understand more and do better when we run across this in our lives. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having me and for being willing to have this conversation. I appreciate it.
The Soul Grit podcast is a production of Soul Grit Resources. You can find more at soulgritresources.com or on the socials at Soul Grit Resources. You can email me at info@soulgritresources.com.